My fellow Americans, I am about to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
And realism impelled me to admit that we still have a long, long way to go.
Good morning. I'm Liz Irwin, Group Publisher of Missouri Lawyers Media, the Arizona News Service, and Minnesota Lawyer. We are honored to present today the unique perspective of an attorney whose personal and professional journey has been a quest for fairness. In a historic decision in June, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the 1964 Civil Rights Act protects gay and transgender workers from workplace discrimination based on sex. For attorney, longtime activist, and transgender icon Kylar Broadus, the ruling represents a long-sought victory after decades of struggle. Luigi Del Puerto, Associate Publisher of the Arizona News Service, talked recently with Mr. Broadus about his journey and unique perspective. Join me now as we share that conversation.
Thanks, Liz. And as Liz mentioned, my name is Luigi Del Puerto. I'm the Associate Publisher and Editor of the Arizona Capital Times, which is based in Phoenix, in Arizona. Our guest this morning is Kylar W. Broadus. Mr. Broadus is a Black trans man who has been a pioneer in the movement as an attorney, longtime activist, public speaker, author, and professor. Mr. Broadus is known globally for his avant-garde work in the LGBT and trans movements. For his work, he was awarded the Trans Trailblazer Award by the LGBT Bar Association of Los Angeles and issued a proclamation by the City Attorney's Office of Los Angeles on March 2019. He is the founder and director of the Trans People of Color Coalition, a national organization dedicated to the civil rights of transgender people of color. He is the first transgender American to testify before the United States Senate in favor of the Employment Non-Discrimination Act in 2012. So Kylar, thank you for joining me this morning.
Thank you, Luigi. Glad to be here.
Let's talk about you growing up. What were the first inklings you had that you are different from other girls?
Well, that question even sounds strange to me, Luigi, because I knew immediately when I heard the words boy and girl to me, and that may sound strange to your audience or others, and every trans person's experience isn't the same. But for me, I knew when I first heard the words and felt when other people would call me a girl that I wasn't a girl. And my parents also got that very early when we had conversations later, because when I grew up, there was not information about transgender people out there in the world. There was Christine Jurgensen, and that was it as far as national news or information about trans people. But I knew I was different from a very early age, and that was before the age of 5. So I was able to delineate that I was not, in my mind, a girl.
What were the manifestations of that?
Yeah, some activists don't like that, but for me, that was my experience. I was in the wrong body. So for me, I actually kept trying to go back into my mother's womb, and I wanted to regress to come out correctly. And Black parents do one thing sort of with their kids. They want you to go fast. In other words, you're out of diapers, you're off a bottle, you're real quickly. And my parents gave me some grace with that, even at a little bit older age, at 5 or 6, when they started to understand what was going on. And again, at that time, there was no literature. My parents were Black Americans during the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And so they were just figuring this out as they went along. I was a gender nonconforming child and actually a color nonconforming child in the 1960s as well. And so the bottom line for me was I did a lot of reading because I could read by 3. My mother had me reading, and 3 and 4, and looking through encyclopedias and anything I could read to find people that were like me.
Was there a moment in which you told your parents that you didn't feel like you belong in the right body, quote unquote? And I wonder if you can recall how they responded to that.
Well, that didn't come until much later. And during my generation, you children didn't speak until they were spoken to. It was a different generation. Although my parents I talked to, they were both my very best friends. And I can tell you they were my rocks through this journey. It was unspoken in my household. They got it, they knew it, and they had my back. I remember being on truck runs with my father or sitting in the car eating ice cream, which is what people did in that era with their parents because there were drive-ups, drive-through restaurants. And people would come by and say, "Oh, your son is with you." And both my parents would just say yes, because I always looked like a male child. My mother would sometimes have reprieves and want to dress me in girly stuff, and it was strange and foreign to me, and it always felt like drag. And there are many pictures of me on those days where I'm not happy, on the days where you're supposed to be happy, dressed up at Easter and all those days, because to me it was drag.
For those who were just meeting you for the first time, for example, they and you were with your parents, they saw you immediately as a boy.
Correct. And, I remember being on truck runs with my dad from 5 on up, and he'd just keep it moving and he'd go, "Yep." And we'd keep unloading what was ever on the truck. And of course, at 5, I'm sure I was more of a nuisance than help. But then I grew, to be a helpful team member, unloading whatever was on the truck or what have you. And my dad always did that, and my mother when we were together as well. But she always tried to gender me to make sure that people knew my gender, and so there was a little bit of tension on that part. And it wasn't, and I came out early for my generation. The baby boomer, last of the baby boomer generation, sort of perpetuated the getting rid of the old myth of coming out and blending in and just being binary, to coming out and being whomever you are as trans people. And so I'm part of that generation that propelled that, just coming out. And then I stayed out because I've always looked like my father and my male cousins. And so, to me, when I had no role models out there, and particularly of color, I decided that it was important for me to stay visible so that others had role models. Because for me, I looked and looked and looked, and I wasted a lot of my life looking instead of just being and enjoying my life.
You are a transgender man. You're a gender non-conforming person while you were growing up, but you're also black. So you're a non-gender non-conforming black person. Did that present extra challenges, if you will?
I think totally. And I would say at my time, I was also a color non-conforming person, because people now just see the US as we've had all of this information about transgender people. There wasn't. And we didn't use the word transgender. And while Christine Jurgensen would be on the national news every now and again, nationally and internationally, that was it. And then until the early 70s when Renee Richards came along, and that was it. And there was barely any information. Occasionally you'd see a small article here or there in some kind of publication, but it didn't really go into the semantics or understanding of who trans people were.
Parents were kind of navigating through this situation in which they didn't have a whole lot of information, and in which you did not have a whole lot of information.
Correct. And amazingly, They just had love for their child, and they loved me unconditionally. I remember my mother at 18 thinking I'm going out in the world, so she was going to tell me I was a girl. And this was one of the most awkward experiences of my life. And she caught me in the kitchen, and I was in the refrigerator, and I was getting something out of the refrigerator, and I turned around, and there was my mother right smack dab in front of me. And she goes, "You know you're a girl, right?" Because there was not this information out there about transgender children and all the things we have now, which is why I have stayed engaged to make sure there's literature out there. So that was her protection for me, and I can look back and understand that she didn't want me to go out in the world and be harmed, or and she wanted to protect her child. So while I'd grown up in my family, and looked at everybody, and even my extended family treated me well and okay, she wanted me to know now I'm going out into the world, so I needed to act a certain way. And I actually avoided that conversation real quickly and abruptly by saying yes, and then just moving away quickly, because I didn't want to encounter or engage in any further conversation, because I didn't have any tools. And at that point, I hadn't engaged in any therapy. And later I did, and found there was none dealing with transgender people. And it was the kind of reparative therapy. And I went to one session of that and thought, boy, this woman needs to repair herself. And I knew that I was different, and nobody could change that for me.
Was that a prompting on your parents' part? They thought that by, or what facilitated that, those therapy sessions, if you will?
I went on my own. I think in Black culture and colors of community, POC communities, we don't naturally gravitate towards therapy. So that was not a demand or request of my parents. We actually do not go to therapy. We are now starting to do those sorts of things. And I think, I don't know if it's just naturally POC families, but I do know that's a tendency in our communities, to not do therapy. But once I started college and I knew there was help on campus, and had been exposed to some LG people, and thought, well, this may be a good thing to do, to hash this out to see if I'm L or G. Because, and of course I was gay, I guess, but lesbian. But because that word never fit me, it never felt right for me. I could never say it in reference to me. I couldn't even get that word out for me because it never fit. And everyone else was worried about putting me in a box, not my parents, but everyone else in the world was. And so I wanted some better understanding. So I went on my own and knew that the first therapist I got, and I didn't even know anything about reparative therapy then, but that's what she was doing. And I didn't go back myself because I thought to myself, honestly, she needs help.
The therapist effectively tried to, I guess, for a lack of a better phrase, fix you.
Yes, she did. And was telling me that I needed this and that, and she could fix me, and yada, yada, yada. And I sat through that session, and you see my eyes now. That's what I thought about it. And once I got up and left, and I was 18 years old, and I thought, she needs fixing. This is not going to work for me, and left there and found another therapist. I had the wherewithal to make that decision on my own, and thought that, this was deep seated. This was something that honestly, I grew up in what we call the buckle of the Bible Belt, that I prayed every day for God to fix me when I grew up. I mean, from a little child on, until I realized that God gave me a brain and I could use it.
Was the prayer that you made, I'm curious about that, was the prayer to God that you made, was it, God, uh, let me be a boy, or make me be a boy, or was it, God, let me be a girl, or make me a girl?
Oh, it wasn't make me be a girl. It was God fix me. I know I'm a boy, and help me be that, so the rest of the world can see who I really am. And when that didn't materialize, I had the understanding that God gave me a brain, so then I needed to figure it out. And we didn't have information access, etc., in in my puberty or teenage years, or I would have definitely pushed my parents did take me to, I'm sure at the urging of the school, a facility. I'll call it a facility, and it was a mental facility. And I remember that visit because I was real young, probably 6 or 7. I had then what would be diagnosed now as trans youth anger, because I was, I wanted to express myself as who I was, but couldn't. And so they recommended it. My mother took me to this facility when they were done with everything. I remember them walking out with me to pair me with my mother. I don't remember the words, but I remember her reaction. She pulled me close to her body, grabbed my little hand, and actually she pulled me behind her body as if to protect me. And she said, "We'll be taking care of this matter at home." And I remember those words. And she goes, "Thank you very much for your time." And the bottom line was that you're not going to do these things to my child. I will protect my child. Basically, she meant herself and my father. And that was, he agreed when she came home and explained what they wanted to do. And I think it had to do with shock therapy, which is what they were still using in those days, because this was the late 1960s. And they were not having it. And so my parents and my father had said the same thing when we got home. So my point is that my parents used their intelligence, and I'm so blessed to have been given to those two people, my parents who are no longer with me. They encouraged me to be me, to grow up and stand tall, and to be proud and to speak loud when things are not right.
So let's fast forward to the time when you were employed and your employer fired you. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened?
Well, you would not believe it, but I was always already dressing just like this. And I had probably a little bit more hair on the top of my head
How old were you then, by the way?
and no facial hair. I was in my late 20s or mid 20s, perhaps. I had been working there for 7 years, about 7 years. And then I announced I was going to legally change my name because the staff had already started calling me by my initials. Most people called me by my initials and not my birth name at that point, up until that point, which was KB. I can tell when people knew me because if somebody calls me that. And nobody called me by my birth name. Even when I wrote checks, I'd have to explain that, why my name was what it was, because people would say, "Why did your parents give you a girl's name? You're a guy." Because back then we wrote checks. We didn't use debit cards. And so I announced that. And then that's when the snowball began to roll because they didn't like that I wanted to change my name. And they didn't get it being about transgender. And I had to switch in bosses, and I got a new male boss as the company was going through reorganization. And he assumed what was going on rather than speak with me. And he seemed to just have it in for me, and things started to snowball. The harassment from my supervisor was so great, and it was so pervasive. It was every day, continuously. He called me every hour, on the hour, all of those sorts of behaviors. I had to leave because the stress was just beyond.
That time, were you already a lawyer or?
I was already a lawyer at that time. I knew that it was wrong, what had happened to me, and then I didn't want it to happen to other people, that I was pushed out of a career that paid well and had good benefits. And I was pushed out only because I was transgender. And nobody understood that, even as I explained that. I was told I couldn't change my name to do this. I was warned that if I cut my hair too short, I was going nowhere in the corporation. And so I got all of those sorts of things.
I'm
At the
curious
case
if you won
back
the
then,
case or what happened to it.
no, because one, the court summarily dismissed my case like they did all cases at that time and said Title VII doesn't apply to transsexuals. And so that's why I've been on board and doing this work for the past 30 plus years now, and that's why I'm happy to see the ruling. And I've had many people call me and say, thank you for doing the work you've done over these past decades, because we finally have a Supreme Court ruling that says Title VII does apply to transgender people and with people with sexual orientation. But yeah, I'm happy for people with sexual orientation, but particularly I'm extremely happy that the court says, of course, it applies to transgender people.
Did it surprise you? Did the ruling? A lot of people were surprised by it, especially given the composition of the U.S. Supreme Court. And I wonder if you were surprised as well.
Well, yes, I was extremely surprised and extremely nervous when it was put before the court, because we have such an extremely conservative, and I know I've used extremely 3 times here, but it fits, because we have a very conservative court. So none of us wanted to try anything that deals with LGBTQ plus people in front of this court. So when
and have an adverse ruling to your cause,
right,
and have that be applied
and
across the country,
applied across the country forever, because we have so many conservative courts now due to this current administration. And so it was a huge fear when this was sent to the Supreme Court. And honestly, myself and many of the litigators that have written briefs on this case were worried and sleepless for many nights and awaiting this ruling with bated breath and fear, including myself, of, oh my God, what is this court going to rule? So I am thankful that this court ruled on the right side of justice and ruled based on stare decisis and case law and not on politics. We've gone too far with the politics and not sticking to judicial and case precedent in a lot of cases. And so I'm extremely thankful that the U.S. Supreme Court did do the right thing.
So, as our audience, our viewers, and our listeners know, the court ruled 6-3 that an employer who fires an individual merely for being gay or transgender violates Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was penned by Justice Neil Gorsuch. And the opinion said a statutory violation occurs if an employer intentionally relies in part on an individual employee's sex when deciding to discharge the employee. And because discrimination on the basis of homosexuality or transgender status requires an employer to intentionally treat individual employees differently because of their sex. An employer who intentionally penalizes an employee for being homosexual or transgender also violates Title VII. I want to ask you one argument against it, and that argument is that Congress is the proper venue to legislate this order, not the courts. I want to get your thoughts on that.
Well, Congress is the proper venue to legislate. The courts are also the proper venue to interpret legislation. And so that is the job of a court. And so the court is not legislating, it's just merely providing interpretation of the legislation. And since we had many circuits with different views, that is the job of the Supreme Court to step in and clear up what is the proper authority. And so that's what the court has done. And so it's done its job. It is not legislating. It is merely stepping in to clear up the confusion of the many rulings in the circuits.
So the other in relation to that criticism, if you will, is the argument that if the Congress wanted to specify that Title VII extends to transgender or gay employees, they would have done so in 1964. They would have made that one clear. And in fact, that they had the opportunity to consider this issue and decided not to by failing legislation that would have expressly clarified this matter.
Well, that argument is false to me as well, because Title VII was enacted in 1964 because race was a huge issue in this country. And if Title VII had not been passed, there would have been a huge war taking place in 1964. So it was based due to the push on racial politics and the atmosphere in 1964. Women were added at the last minute as an afterthought. So there was a different time and a different day when Title VII was passed. Those that argue that are the justices that believe that the law is written and doesn't change over time with society. And that's their right to believe that. So they're saying that the statutes as written don't change over time and stay in that same time period. Well, the United States has changed drastically since 1964. And a point I made earlier about race. In 1964, the United States was not as diverse with racial people as it is now, and race rather. It was really black and white with a few other people that came here. Now, racial diversity is huge in this country. And, I used to be the wrong color all the time back in 1964 and the 70s because I was color nonconforming. And why I have sun damages is because I used to try to sunbathe to make myself blacker so I could fit
I'm sorry,
in.
did you say you were trying to make yourself even tanner, if you will?
No, blacker.
Blacker,
Tan.
blacker.
I didn't mean tanner. And in the 1960s and early 70s, that was a problem. And, because of the colorism, which comes from slavery and our communities, and it still is a problem. But it was hugely a problem if you looked like this and you didn't fit in. And so to argue that if Congress had intended that in 1964, we didn't even talk about transgender people out loud in 1964. All we knew was Christine Jorgensen existed in 1964. The science had not advanced in 1964 regarding transgender people. So that's an argument for people that don't want the Constitution to be a living, breathing document that captures this United States as it continues to grow.
The Civil Rights Act says that it is unlawful, it's illegal for an employer to fail or refuse to hire or to fire an individual, or otherwise discriminate against that person with respect to his compensation, terms, conditions, privileges of employment because of the individual's race, color, religion, national origin, or sex. And now we know that sex, the protections with regards to sex, extends to gay and transgender employees. So let's start with the basics. What are some of the most common manifestations of discrimination based on sex? And I guess the second question is that how does that occur, if you will, in the context of gay or transgender employees?
Common discrimination is based on sex. Sexual harassment comes to mind rapidly to me because many people experience sexual harassment in the workplace. People saying things that make them feel uncomfortable dealing with doesn't even have to be sexual in nature. It can just be put them in an uncomfortable position. Things that are pervasive and continuous in nature. That make them uncomfortable in the workplace. And again, you have to have 15 or more employees to be sued under Title VII, first of all. And then the action, people think these cases are just easy to win or easy to bring. They're not. The actions have to be persistent and pervasive. It means continuous over time and severe enough that somebody brings a suit.
So it's not just one remark or one instance it is something that happens pretty regularly and makes the environment really hostile for the person who's being discriminated upon.
Exactly. To where they are unable to get work done. You know, in my instance, that was happening to me. My new boss called me literally every hour on the hour. He would call me. So that way you can't get any work done if somebody's doing that to you. He'd call me every hour on the hour just with some harassing thing. But that has a serious impact over time on an individual, by the way, emotionally, physically, and all those other things, which is why it's considered harassment. And in my situation, he didn't say anything sexual, although he did kept treating me like a lesbian when I'm trying to tell you I'm not a lesbian and you don't understand what's going on by not even allowing me to speak or say what's going on. You're telling me in a patronizing way what's going on and how you're going to fix it, and I'm not even allowed to speak or tell you I'm not a lesbian and I'm trans. And that would be in my situation, an example. And that happens in many situations for people as an example of harassment, not being heard, not being listened to by human resources or the manager to even know what's going on to deal with the situation.
So, as you mentioned, sexual harassment doesn't have to come in the form of, for example, unwelcome sexual advances or requests for sexual favors, right? So, harassment doesn't have to be sexual in nature. It could be offensive remarks about a person's sex, and that's pervasive. That happens regularly. It creates a hostile environment for that person. Now that we have this opinion, how does this ruling change? Uh, in this instance, uh, the the workplace.
Changes the playing field totally because you can now just sue under Title VII uh, based on not only race, religion, color, national origin, or sex. Sex now includes what falls under sex are many things. The court says that under Title VII, sex now includes in its definition transgender people and sexual orientation. So if you violate Title VII, then the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination in the workplace, then you can be sued by a transgender person. And I could have sued, in my case, under Title VII without having to prove anything else but that they violated Title VII or for sexual harassment. And this changes the playing field greatly and has been a long battle getting here for many people that have fought for this victory.
So let me ask you about individuals who may right now believe that they're being discriminated upon because of their sexual orientation, because they're transgender. What are the steps that that person needs to do to kind of document and potentially prepare for a case?
Well, as you mentioned, I am a lawyer and I tell people always to document. Documentation is key. If you're keeping, because one, if you come back later and try to remember what happened now, 10 chances out of one, you're going to forget something. So I tell people to make sure they're documenting the experience, whether it's journaling, whether it's keeping track of emails that have been sent to you of negative things, and emails, following up in emails when somebody has done or said something to you to make sure that you capture it, and then sending those emails to yourself in another email that so when you're walked out of the company that you have that electronic documentation in another place besides the company's email.
So maybe email, email any form of communication that you think will back up your case. Email it to your own personal email.
Exactly. Email it to your personal email. Then keep a separate written diary. 8, 11, or 12. Today, I was reprimanded for nothing, but this is what happened, and write it down. I came to work and I was on time, but was reprimanded for being late. And these are the witnesses that were there, because you're going to need witnesses, and you're going to need to figure out who really is going to be a witness or not, because a lot of times people don't want to come forward to mess up their own job. to be a target at their job. So you got to know people that will also help substantiate. So, and be thinking this out ahead. And it's scary to do that. I've been in that position because you're thinking, God, this is not going to happen to me. Gosh, I don't want to go through this. But sadly, it does happen to people. And you've got to also be willing to record conversations, but you've got to be able to do that in secret. And in some jurisdictions, you have to realize that the recording cannot be used in court later because both parties or the other party has to know they're being recorded.
I was just gonna ask you about that because,
But
for example, in Arizona, in our state,
yeah,
you can record anybody without that person knowing he or she is being recorded, and that's fine. And correct me if I'm wrong. In some states, you're not allowed to do that.
and exactly, that's my point. In other states, you're not allowed to do that, but you can still use it as evidence to negotiate in those states. Because one, you can have the documentation for your case, and two, people don't like getting caught in recordings because a lot of times things settle before they hit the courtroom door. Most cases do, as we know. So, say there's an arbitration clause in the situation. Arbitration rules may be different than litigation rules, so that can come in an arbitration or mediation where it wouldn't come in with the rules of evidence, the recording. Makes sense, Luigi?
It does make sense. If you're not able to use it in court, then you kind of use it as a leverage, and maybe at that and eventually come to an agreement that's more favorable to you, if you will, or that is satisfactory to you. So
Right.
let me ask you about the companies then, right? So we have this Supreme Court ruling. It's the law of the land. I've had or seen HR trainings in which they say these are the protected classes. And by the way, these are the manifestations of discrimination. And if you discriminate against any person that's protected under these classes, then you've just violated the law. But in those training sessions, if you will, they've also said sexual orientation is not a protected class. And in some states, they are a protected class, but in other states, they're not. And so that has now changed. And so I wonder, what do companies need to do immediately after this court opinion?
And that's a great question because we had about 22 states that protected people in sexual orientation and the District of Columbia. We had 22 states that did that. But we had, more that didn't protect transgender people or sexual orientation. And lots that had state or local laws that did. So here are some things that employers need to do to help shore up their house. Review written and other policies to ensure compliance with the new legal standard and whatever policies that you have in place, written and other unwritten informal policies that you may have had around. You want to check all those policies to make sure you're in compliance with them. And I would do it with haste because you don't want to get caught in a position where you haven't checked the policies and made sure you're in compliance. Second thing would be to amend equal opportunity, sexual harassment, and retaliation policies to make sure they're up to date. You don't want to fall out of compliance and then do something that gets you a charge with the EEOC. So make sure you've amended those policies. And then if you have any diversity and inclusion statements, you might want to go revisit those and make sure your statements are correct and up to date. And then the last thing I would say is implementation training for your managers and others to ensure that they understand and are is sensitive to the effects of these changes in the law. You want them to be sure they understand and roll out the new changes correctly.
The companies have to update their manuals. They have to update their training manuals. Any statements on diversity and inclusion, they'll have to revisit that. You also mentioned training the managers, and letting them know that this opinion came out and it is now the law of the land. Would you recommend that the employees also have, not just the managers, sorry, but the employees as well, go through um, an updated training, if you will, as specifically just on this issue, for example?
I do. I think it's important. A lot of employers don't do that, and I think that's where we miss the boat, so to speak, and end up in the water. Because if employees are not trained, then they do not understand. And I think, the managers need to be trained and take it seriously first, and then the employees, because I know now on several or from previous cases I've worked with that that's where it breaks down, is that the employees are not trained, and then they don't take it seriously. They don't have an understanding, and then they make statements and continue to, and that's damaging in the workplace culture to them and to the trans employee. And it just continues to go and go and go. And one, the employer is going to be liable for that. But the bigger part is that if you have a workplace culture like that, then no employee is going to feel safe, not just the trans employee. But if you show that you allow one employee to be beaten down for some issue, whether it's transness or not, then all of your employees know that they're not safe in the workplace. And employers do owe employees a burden or a duty, rather, to provide a safe workplace. So the best assets that all employers have are their employees. And we sometimes kind of forget that. And when we do, that's when the mess is created. So if you treat all employees well, including trans employees, then that message is sent to other employees that may have issues, whatever they are, that I'm going to also be respected in the workplace.
So outside of your company updating its manuals, its training manuals, its diversity and inclusion statements, what can you as a person, as an employee, as an individual do to really avoid discriminating against a transgender or gay colleague, a gay co-worker? What are some of the steps that you would recommend like folks do right now?
There is so much information at your fingertips these days. One, you could go out and Google and get lots of information on transgender people. And two, you could go get books at the library. There are tons of books that have been written. There are resource centers. You can go to an LGBT center and find out information. But, one of the things I always do, and when I do diversity trainings, is I ask people, do you have a friend that's transgender? And most people will say, wow, no, I don't. I would say, after reading, make a friend, make a coffee date with the transgender person. So if you don't have a trans person in your close circle of friends, go out and make that a priority to do that. Three, go to events that are about trans people. I've spent the last 2 months doing tons of trans events. In June and July, I have been filled. I've been on so many platforms, and I'm not just bragging. It's just been very busy, and with COVID, and I've been asked to speak on so many platforms, and I've been honored to do that, to do education, and I've committed my life to do that. Because if I can educate one person, that's one more person that is understanding and that gets it. So go to events, whether they're entertaining or educational. Even if they're entertaining, you're being educated about trans people. And the last thing I'm going to share with you is don't perpetuate the negativity. If you hear anything said negative about trans people and have started to educate yourself about trans people, don't allow the negative rhetoric. I think trans women get most of it because they're more visible in society and people see them more. Us trans guys tend to blend in. I use the word I am of trans experience because I am a man that came through as trans, to my manhood as a trans man, but I'm a man of trans experience. But trans women tend to get a lot more hate. I get hate once people find out I'm trans, but, I don't stand for it. But the bottom line is, nor should our allies. Allies to me are not allies as separate from the community. They are a part of the community. I call them accomplices. And it's funny, one of my mentees does this work, and I was on his platform on one of his panels, and it was fun to see him use the same word, accomplices, because allies are accomplices in the movement. They help us get stuff done, and their heart and soul is just as much a part of this movement.
So just to kind of sum it up, get out of your comfort zone and
Yeah.
really educate yourself.
Yes.
I want to go back to the time that you spoke before Congress on the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. Tell us a little bit about that experience.
Well, one, I was scared to death. Um, I got a call, and I think it was, I know it was from Senator Tom Harkin's office, and he's no longer in the Senate. He's was from Illinois, so a fellow Midwesterner. And they said they'd been trying to track me down, which is always difficult to do because I'm throwing multiple plates up in the air all the time. And it was 2 weeks before they wanted me to speak before the U.S. Senate, and I was like, "This is a joke, right?" And I said that on the phone because my assistant was right near me, 2 feet away. And they're like, "No, this is not a joke. We would like you to come and give testimony for the on behalf of the Employment Non-Discrimination Act," which I had been working on for decades as well, had been on some drafting committees for that. And I was like, okay, I'll do that. Then I sat down in my chair and stopped everything else. And I was like, whoa, this is a big task because I felt like I can tell my story, but my fear was I needed to encapsulate within my story other people's story. So it wasn't just the burden of telling my story. I needed to bootstrap on the trans movement's story to my story. So then it became bigger to me. And that's what made me worry.
You felt the need at that point to represent the transgender community well, and there was that pressure on your shoulders.
Yes. And I felt it hugely.
So how did it go?
It went well. I was surprised when I arrived. There was this man at the door. I'm like, who's this man? Because I avoid people, so I'm like avoiding him. And he comes right, and he's from Kellogg's Corporation. He's the VP. I forget his name, and he gave testimony that day. And that's why he was trying to greet me when I came into the room, because he wanted to meet me. And I was just trying to avoid people and get to the table and sit down so I would get calm. And normally I'm calm. I never had troubles public speaking because that's been my thing since I was, I learned how to do that since I was young. And I had a great mentor, which was my mother, who taught me how to do this, and my father also. But that was the pressure. I was doing it for the trans movement and weaving it in. And it went well. And I saw many trans people after that who would cry with me saying, "You told my story." And that's what I wanted to do. And that's what has got me a little teary now, because I've heard that from many trans people and I received emails, and that's what I wanted to accomplish. And that's what I was able to. It's kind of funny because I was a professor, and so my students had never seen me in that state. And they're like, "What's wrong with you? Why did you deliver that way?" And it's like they don't understand that you have to tell a story, and you have to tell it in a certain way to different bodies. And so I needed to be emotive for Congress to get it, and also the senators, Republican and otherwise, thanked me for telling the story because they got it. And because that hurt, because I've lost a lot during this lifetime because of ignorance and prejudice. And people don't realize that, because it seems like we've got a lot. even though we've lost what we gained during the Obama administration under this administration, because we still have more than we started out with when I started it out in this game.
You mentioned President Obama, and you had the opportunity to stand with him while he signed an executive order adding protections for millions of workers back in 2014. Tell us about that experience.
Well, I must tell you, we were blessed. This whole country doesn't get how blessed we were to have a president that understood people. And I think we will in hindsight for the people that don't like him, because I've worked with through several administrations and doing policy. And his administration was different because he did understand people. And I've met him and worked with him several times due to my work overlapping. And so I had met him before I hit that stage several times. And I was honored that he called me to stand beside him. And I would be honored any day to stand beside President Obama for the work that he continues to do and has done. But in particular, he understood right away what was needed with gay and lesbian, the LGBTQ movement. He understood trans people. There was no need to explain to him or Mrs. Obama, Michelle Obama, who we were, because they were organizers. They had organized on the ground. They knew who we were. And I remember a friend of mine, she has a picture in her house, who tried to explain to Michelle Obama who trans people were, and she's a lesbian. And Michelle Obama goes, "Oh, I got it," and it started telling her stories about trans people. So that order protected more people that were gay and lesbian than any other order. And I used to know the numbers, but that's all been taken away because it was done by executive order. But it was several million people that were LGBTQ. And it was an honor to stand beside him. We had to wait for hours because he was dealing with foreign affairs, but he came to the room very present and very much appreciative of us. And it was an honor. And he thanked us all for the work that we did.
In the last couple of years, the U.S. Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage and now protected or extended the protections, workplace protections to transgender and gay employees. And I wonder, when you're surveying the field, what is next for the gay rights movement? And more specifically, what is next for the transgender rights movement?
Well, I think we're going to see two separate things, because the gay rights movement is far ahead of the trans movement. And I think people don't see that or understand that a lot of times because we're lumped together for various reasons. And the gay rights movement will take that first. They've got marriage, and I'm just sort of doing a they. They've got marriage, they've got employment protections. They can use public accommodations. Nobody is worried about where they're going to the bathroom at. I do see some family law issues or reproductive rights issues down the road, being, how families are formed. Those are issues that are being litigated. And, when we started this movement, those issues were not problems because I did family law, and now they're becoming problems because of pushback to gaining rights. I see, because we could get, custody. We fought to get some of those things early on, and they've been taken back off the table due to pushback because of some of the rights gained. So I see that being the avenue for gay rights, and still a lot of this reparative therapy stuff is being worked on, which is a huge issue because, I could have gotten suckered into that at 18 years old, but I was like, at one visit, and I knew what she was doing. But a lot of people don't have anybody, and they're not strong-minded, and they're looking for somebody to guide them, and we don't need therapists out there doing that. So, family law issues with children for gay and lesbians and bisexuals, that live with same sex partners, and then sports issues. For trans people, we would go to sports issues. Us competing with them. They're more really worried about the trans women competing. Are they on the same playing field? There's tons of research that has been done, that is being done, that shows, yes, you are, but that's still issues there. And then for trans people, we get employment, but we don't have public accommodations. People don't want us going to the bathrooms with them. But, what I tell a lot of people is if we've been living under the old model, so you've already been going to the bathrooms with us, you've already been going to the locker rooms with us, and you just didn't know it. And because we've come out as visible trans people, it's now become an issue for you. And we are only asking for what is lawful. We're not asking for what is unlawful. Those people that are predators are not necessarily trans people. And these fears that people have are creating are ridiculous because people just want to use the restroom, and that's what we're asking for. We're not asking for anything illegal, or we are not child predators or those sorts of things. When I go to the restroom, I just need to go to the restroom. There were years where I didn't go to the restroom in public because I had an F on my birth certificate, and then I just started going to the men's room. And we probably are going to have to deal with birth certificate issues for trans people and getting those changed because not all states allow that. And then I'm not sure what Trump is going to do around passports because he's been working secretly to undo everything that had been done. And then a lot of people want to add the X marker, which is interesting because way back we used to have the X marker for when people couldn't sign their names or were illiterate. And now, which I find interesting because I know that sort of history. And we used to have X markers on things in the 70s. And now trans people are calling that on that for non-binary people, because I want to make sure we do mention non-binary people, because that is not new. People seem to think that is new, but that's always been a part of our culture, are people that don't fit within the binary. We just talk about it more now because we have social media more, but that has been in every single generation and around for decades. And so people would like to put X markers on their birth certificates and driver's license and other documents. So those are some of the issues I think trans people will be tackling, just besides employment. And I think that one of the things I would like to ask people to do is, even though we've got this law, we have had Brown versus the Board of Education since 1954. We still have segregated schools. So I would like people to be mindful of that while it's illegal to have segregated schools, there's still been litigation to desegregate schools. So implementation takes a long time. And because we have this law doesn't mean discrimination will stop. We need people to hire trans people and treat them well and know how to treat them. I know of too many unemployed trans people out there that are young and haven't been able to get jobs, and I've tried to help them. And people look at me and say, well, you're employable. Well, actually, no, I'm not. I always create my own work. And we need to have people understand our issues and be able to work with us. And even, I will say, even within our own LGBT community, people need to learn about trans issues and understand them better in the workplace.
Kylar, this has been a really great conversation with you. I learned a lot. I want to thank you for taking the time. Good luck in your activism and in your work as an attorney, as an activist, as a professor, and as a public speaker. And I guess I'll see you around.
I'll see you around, Luigi. This has been fun. Thank you very much.
Thank you.